Hey, it's Shane the Creative, and welcome to my video. As you can probably tell from the title and or thumbnail, I'm going to be exploring the infamous character Rick Murray from the TV show Degrassi The Next Generation. We're going to look through his actions and the actions of others throughout Rick's run on the show to try to answer a question I've seen debated within the fandom of whether Rick was a villain or a victim. Before we get started, I'd like to give a content warning. In this video, I'm going to be discussing serious and possibly triggering topics such as domestic abuse, school shootings, violence, and bullying, so please continue with caution. Now, let's get started. So first, we're going to do a quick overview of Rick's time on the show for context. We're first introduced to Rick in Season 3, Episode 8, when Terry has a secret admirer, and by the end of the episode, it's revealed that Rick is the secret admirer. In Episode 10, they're officially dating, and Rick is shown to be supportive and a gentleman towards Terry, but we quickly see moments of him being very controlling and jealous, specifically of Jimmy's and Terry's friendship. Rick also has a temper and seems to be insecure as he constantly needs reassurance from Terry. The first instance of Rick becoming physical with Terry is when he grabs her by the wrist in a fit of rage. The next day, he brings her flowers and apologizes, admitting to his jealousy of Jimmy. Later that day, Paige and Hazel invites Terry to a girls' night, and she states how she has to check in with Rick first to see if it's okay. After Terry mentions it to Rick, he wants to join in and assumes that he can't go because they either want to talk about him or check out other guys. Terry calls him crazy, and in return, Rick slaps Terry across the face and then apologizes afterwards. In the next scene, the girls are together for their girls' night, and Terry is bragging to Paige about Rick and all the great things he does. Hazel asks if they ever fight, and Terry says sometimes, but passes it off as Rick being sensitive. Hazel then notices Terry's bruised wrist and lip and asks if Rick caused them. Terry becomes defensive and lashes out, accusing Hazel of being jealous and wanting to take away the fact that someone loves her. After storming away, Terry runs into Rick, who is waiting in the alley for her. He tells Terry that he loves her and how special she is, but then quickly tries to dictate when and who Terry can be around by suggesting a rule that she could only see her friends in school and not outside of school. Terry expresses that she feels suffocated and attempts to leave, but Rick shoves Terry into the wall and again quickly apologizes. Terry tells him that that's the last time he'll touch her. Rick makes one last gesture for forgiveness by leaving a rose on Terry's locker, like he did when he was her secret admirer. Despite still caring for him, Terry takes the rose and steps on it in front of Rick, solidifying their breakup. At this point, we've seen repeat behavior of Rick lashing out when enraged and resorting to physical action, and then immediately following them up with an apology that seems to have no real bearing on them as he continues to do the same thing that he apologized for in the first place. In episode 17 of the same season, Paige is hosting a road trip. Terry is reluctant to join as she'd be the only one there without a partner. We then see Rick again in class with Terry. Rick approaches her to partner up for trust exercises. Terry is hesitant but eventually allows him to be her partner and participates. After class, they're speaking again, and Rick apologizes yet again for his abusive actions, possibly taking accountability this time. Terry seemingly accepts it, considering she then brings him along for the trip. Her friends are clearly against it, but allows it, fearing that Terry wouldn't join at all if he couldn't. We see that immediately after arriving to their destination, Rick starts annoying the friend group, and it doesn't take long for an argument to erupt. Paige checks in with Terry, who says that everything is okay because Rick apologized. Paige then states that his kind always does, so they can get another shot in. Rick jumps in, and him and Paige goes back and forth until Paige calls Rick a psycho. He responds by kicking at her car, then storming off into the nearby woods. Terry sides with Rick and tells Paige that she does, in fact, push her around. And Paige tells her to go join Rick then, which she does. Terry catches up to Rick, who's kicking around in another fit of rage. She apologizes to him for Paige, and he yells how Paige doesn't matter, so Terry tells him to calm down. He starts to calm himself and shares how happy he is that they're back together before they start kissing. After kissing, while they're holding hands, Terry tries to lead Rick back to the others, but Rick pulls in the opposite direction, wanting them to go on the walk. Rick pulls at Terry more and brings up Paige calling him a psycho, which seems to be an insult that especially triggers that rage within Rick. They start going back and forth as Rick is yelling about Terry picking Paige over him and how she's not going back. That's when Rick either shoves Terry or releases his grip of her arms, which leads to Terry falling backwards and hitting her head directly on the cinder block. We then cut back to the group. Paige expresses her concern to Spinner about Terry not returning yet, so they both go out looking for her. They find Rick kneeling in front of a passed out Terry who's bleeding from her head. After Rick runs away, Paige and Spinner rushes to Terry's aid. Terry is then in the hospital in a coma, and before she undergoes surgery to have a blood clot removed, Spinner and Paige talks to Terry's father, who's shocked and confused about what happened, stating how Terry was over the moon for Rick. He then learns that Terry's friends knew about the abuse and angrily asks Paige and Spinner why they didn't come to him about it. Afterward, Paige and Spinner begin to lash out and point fingers at each other as to being the one to blame for this happening to Terry. The next day, Spinner spots Rick in a car outside of the school and goes and yanks him out. Rick pleads for Spinner to stop as he yells and yanks Rick around, which Spinner responds with asking if Terry told him to stop. Right before Spinner gets to get his hit in, Paige jumps in and tells him to stop. Rick's mother then comes out from the school and cries for Spinner to stop as she gets in between the two. She then tells both of them to stay away from her son. Spinner runs away and Paige follows behind. While crying, Spinner states how he's just like Rick, how they're both violent, but Paige reassures him that he's not and comforts him. They go and visit Terry again after her surgery and attempt to apologize to her father, but he apologizes to the kids instead, as he was angry that he hadn't noticed abuse himself despite the amount of times that Rick has been at their home. I believe it's important to take into account how affected Terry's friends are by this incident to have some insight on the events and their actions that are to come. In the next season, Season 4, Rick returns to Degrassi in Episode 4 to finish his 10th grade year, to the dismay of his fellow students. Students like Emma, Paige, Spinner, and Jimmy are very vocal about being against Rick's return, and they want to make it very apparent to him that he's not welcome. At first, their actions consist of simply ignoring him and giving him nasty glares after he tries to speak to them, and Emma standing in his way to block him from walking in the halls. Rick then attempts to talk to Paige one-on-one to bury the hatchet. He shares that he's in therapy and working on his anger, and asks about Terry, which upsets Paige so much so that she rushes to the restroom. After witnessing this and comforting Paige, Emma vows to help get Rick out of their school. At this point, we start to see their attempts and actions quickly begin to progress. That same day after school, while the gang is at the dot, Rick shows up. Emma approaches him and threatens him before forcibly making him leave the dot, which is followed by a wave of cheers. Then Emma and Paige form a silent protest at the school, an orange ribbon campaign for students against violence towards women, which is a great cause, especially to advocate for their friend Terry, but the silent protest is used as a way to further alienate Rick, and it works. We see how most of the student body joins in on either ostracizing Rick or actually getting physical with Rick, like by shoving him into lockers and purposely bumping into him and knocking books out of his hand. Sean and Ellie are shown to be two of the only students who's against this kind of call of action. We then see Rick attempting to give Emma a $554 check to go towards the campaign, and as an act of forgiveness. While Emma attempts to reject the offer, Alex jumps in and takes the check and tells Rick off. Emma then accuses Alex of not caring about the cause, and this is when we get to see some insight on Alex's personal gripe against Rick. She indirectly shares how her mother is a victim of domestic abuse. Later on, the gang is again at the dot when Rick enters to make an order. Alex mentions Rick and Emma's interaction at the school earlier, which leads to Paige thinking that Emma was starting to wimp out on their original plan. Emma responds by tripping Rick as he walked past her after saying hi, causing him to spill his coffee all over himself. Following directly after that, Jay gets up and grabs Rick and drags him outside to the nearby alley with the crowd following behind. Jay beats on Rick, and when Alex joins in to try to get her hits in, Emma stops her, telling her and the crowd that that's enough, resulting in them all leaving. The next day, we see Paige and Hazel purposely ignoring Emma now, and then Rick approaches Emma to thank her, but she tells him not to, reassuring that she still doesn't like him, but that things had gone too far. Emma then asks why he chose to return to Degrassi, and Rick answers how he loved Degrassi, although it's horrible now, and that he wants to show everyone how much he's changed for the better. We continue to see the students of Degrassi bullying Rick over the next couple of episodes, but in episode 6, we see Toby and Rick forming a friendship after being paired together for a class assignment. They initially bond over their shared knowledge and their interest for their female classmates, which leads to them making a bet to see who can get a kiss from Emma out of the two of them. After Toby lets Emma in on the bet, she gives Toby a kiss on the cheek, but then gives Rick the same so he wouldn't feel left out. At this point, we start to see Emma becoming more friendly with Rick, as her and Toby are two of the only students that actually talks to and hangs out around him. Episode 7 starts off with more bullying of Rick, as Spinner and Jimmy throws his hat into a dumpster, then shoving Rick into the dumpster himself. This is when Rick starts to retaliate against his bullies, first by vandalizing Spinner and Jay's car. Then Rick even starts assaulting them back rather than just taking the verbal abuse, as he does with Jimmy after they run into each other in the halls. Before Jimmy gets the chance to do anything to Rick, Mr. Simpson interrupts him and forces Jimmy to join the school trivia team alongside Rick, Emma, and Toby for the upcoming Whack Your Brain competition show. Both Jimmy and Rick are extremely upset by this, Rick so much so that he wants to drop out of the team, but Emma convinces him to stay. We then see Rick attempting to bring all the bullying he's endured to Principal Radish's attention, but Radish completely dismisses him. He basically tells Rick how there's nothing he can do and that it's up to Rick to try to get along too, because it takes two to tango. His last statement to Rick is to, quote, "come back if anything serious happens," end quote. Then next, we see Spinner, Jay, and Alex wanting to get back at Rick for him vandalizing their cars. They confront Toby about Rick's whereabouts, and it leads to Toby getting a busted lip at the hands of Jay. At the trivia team meeting, there's a moment when Jimmy realizes the severity of the bullying that Rick has been experiencing at the hands of him and his fellow classmates after Jimmy requests to know who gave the busted lip to Toby. Rick shares how it's the same people putting him through hell daily and that they're only targeting Toby now because of his association to Rick. Afterwards, while the team is practicing trivia, we start to see Rick and Jimmy warm up to each other. Once practice is over, the team is walking in the halls together and chatting when Spinner, Jay, and Alex approaches them. Jimmy quickly shuts down their continued bullying of Rick, much to their dismay. We start to see Rick becoming quickly attached to his teammates, like telling his mother how the four of them are inseparable friends, despite the fact that him and Jimmy just started mending ties. We also see him starting to form romantic feelings for Emma, despite her only ever expressing how she views Rick in a platonic way. There's another instance during the competition of Whack Your Brain, which is filmed and aired live. Right before the break, after scoring another point for Degrassi, Rick grabs and holds Emma's hand for too long, where she has to uncomfortably pull it away. During the break, Jimmy and Rick are in the restroom. While Jimmy is giving Rick his props, Spinner and Jay come in. They congratulate Rick and claims they're cool now. But after they both leave, we see how Spinner and Jay are only faking for their overall plan to embarrass Rick during the lightning round. Back to the competition, right before the lightning round starts, Rick whispers to Emma that this is all for you. Rick wins the round and secures the first place spot for their team. That's when Alex executes the plan and drops paint and feathers all over Rick in front of everyone. Emma catches up to Rick as he's leaving and comforts him, but then Rick attempts to kiss her. Emma pushes him off and Rick says he thought she loved him, and Emma says that she pitied him before leaving Rick to himself. After that, Rick goes home and retrieves his father's gun. The next episode starts with Rick returning to school that same day. Toby attempts to comfort him and suggests him going home, but Rick insists on staying. We see both Toby and Jimmy separately coming to Rick's defense. Toby against JT and Jimmy against Spinner, which leads to a physical fight. In the cafeteria, Paige approaches Rick, and Rick instantly reaches for his gun that's hidden in his backpack, unbeknownst to Paige. But he slowly starts to retreat, while Paige tells him how the prank done to him was childish and sickening. He then apologizes to Paige again for hurting Terry. Then we see Rick in the restroom and he hides in a stall once he hears someone coming in. Jay and Spinner enter, and once they realize Rick is in there, they begin to speak of the plan as if it was Jimmy who was behind it and helped set it up, which leads to Rick going after his first target, Jimmy. After shooting Jimmy, he then comes face to face with Sean, Emma, and Toby with his gun in hand. They attempt to walk away, but Rick demands them to stop. While Rick is speaking to them, Sean tries to reason with him as he slowly approaches, but Rick proclaims that his life can't get any worse and that it's too late before aiming the gun at Emma. Sean goes for the gun, and there's a struggle before a gunshot goes off between the two of them. We later learn that it was Rick who was shot and died at the scene. Although Rick's run on the show was short, it was extremely impactful. His actions caused him to be one of the most infamous characters of the entirety of the show. So, to address the question at hand, should he be viewed as a victim or as a villain? I personally don't believe there's a simple way to answer that. If you were to pick one, then you would be completely ignoring the other 50% of Rick's character and the other events revolving around him. It's important that we acknowledge that Rick was both Terry's abuser and a victim of vicious bullying. People are more complex than just being good or bad, and I think the writers of the show did a good job at exploring that. In episode 9, we see students and teachers reflecting on the shooting and the events leading up to it. Mr. Simpson makes a point of acknowledging that there's nothing that could justify what Rick did, but to completely write him off as this evil monster psycho does nothing to help understand why it happened, nor how to prevent it from happening again. Mr. Simpson also calls out Principal Radish for his lack of action when it came to the bullying that Rick was experiencing that he was well aware of.
Of course I did. I bet you can't remember a word he said. This tragedy, Dana, could have been prevented if you hadn't...
Which was a great commentary to include into the episode, as there are far too many real-life instances of schools and staff not taking the proper precautions to protect students who may be experiencing harassment and bullying, and how it's not taken seriously until events like this happen where they resort to hurting someone or hurting themselves. It should never have to take for someone to be harmed for people, especially adults that's supposed to be there to help and guide you, to actually care and do something. Now, when it comes to Rick, there's some extra nuance needed for this conversation, because at the same time, I understand why some of the students wanted to have Rick out of the school. Rick was physically abusive to his girlfriend and fellow classmate Terry, and was the cause of her being in a coma. The students had every right to feel uncomfortable about his return to the school, especially Terry's friends. And as someone who advocates against violence towards women, I more than likely would have been a part of Emma and Paige's ribbon campaign myself. But there's a difference between holding Rick accountable, maybe even publicly shaming him, and just flat out bullying and harassing him. And we see that shift in the show around the point after they held the Ribbon campaign. We will see students that will use this call of action against Rick as a way to let out their own aggression and anger and just to use him as a personal punching bag. Students specifically like Jay. Unlike characters like Paige, Jimmy, Spinner, Emma, and Alex, Jay had no real rhyme or reason behind his disdain towards Rick. He wasn't friends with Terry. He seemingly didn't care about the actual cause nor the campaign, and it isn't shown that he's targeting Rick specifically for him being an abuser. Now, I can acknowledge that even if he never states it like how Alex did, that his beef with Rick is because of him being an abuser, doesn't mean that that wasn't the case. But considering Jay's history of being an aggressive bully at the school already, who then went on to bully students like Toby just for being seen with Rick, I'm left to believe that Jay's vicious bullying against Rick was solely for his own personal pleasure and because Rick was an easy target. And honestly, I believe that became the case for Spinner as well. Of course, it was about Terry at first, but gradually we see him amp up his antics against Rick, and not to mention how Spinner has a history of bullying and picking at students for fun at their expense as well. It's important to hold Rick accountable for his actions, but resorting to violent bullying was not the way to go. What actually prompted me to make this video about Rick is a great video I watched titled How to Deal with a Bully as Seen on TV by one of my favorite channels, Cheyenne Lynn. She didn't mention Degrassi, but still the point she made from the shows she did mention very much made me think about Rick's storyline, and I highly recommend y'all checking out her video and channel. I feel like it would have been easier to write Rick off as just being this bad person had Rick came back to the school with the sole intent of committing a mass shooting just out of spite or pure callous, as we see more of in current times in real life. But his decision to even bring a gun back to school was a direct result of being beat down to his breaking point. I'm not shy to call out issues I have with the writing of this show, as you could probably tell from my other videos on my channel. But I love the way that they went about writing Rick and his storyline. Not only did it bring attention and awareness to several important issues, but it also used the nuance needed to be tackling such topics, which is pretty impressive, especially considering that this was back in the early 2000s, showcasing how flawed and complex humans are, that there's not just good or bad, black or white. If there were to be one thing that I wish the writers would have done with Rick's storyline, it would be showing more of his rehabilitation. We only really hear that Rick is in therapy for his abusive behavior towards Terry. It would have been a great touch to see at least one scene of him in his therapy session leading up to the school shooting. And one more thing I want to acknowledge that the writers did was showing and allowing for other characters to react and respond in various manners, such as being extremely angry and unsympathetic of Rick in his death after his final actions. Although I'm making a point that we shouldn't demonize Rick, I can also understand the reaction of the students and parents involved and affected by the school shooting. So it was needed for them to showcase how characters like Ashley and JT display only anger and lacking remorse for Rick after the shooting and his death as a way to respond to such a tragedy. I enjoyed rewatching and analyzing Rick and his overall arc within the show. If you made it to this point of the video, thank you so much for sticking along, as I'm sure that even after I finish editing this down, it'll still be a bit on the longer side. I definitely plan on making more videos like this, so if you enjoyed, consider leaving a like and subscribing and even a comment. Like I always say in all my Degrassi videos, I love discussing with other fans in the comments, so let me know if you agree, if you disagree, or if you have any other commentary you would want to include in on this topic. And shout out again to Cheyenne Lynn, whose video even inspired me to make this. Love her content, it's amazing, and I definitely recommend anyone who hasn't seen any of her videos yet to check them out. Well, until next time, y'all have a great week. Peace.